I was in a car accident 3 years ago. I was told it was pretty serious, but I don't remember any of it. My memories from that time are foggy, disconnected bits and pieces. There's one thing, though, that I remember so clearly it still haunts me. They told me I was in a coma for about 6 weeks. Most people think being in a coma means you're unconscious, but that's not entirely true. You don't respond to stimuli and you can't communicate, but that doesn't mean that you're completely unaware or unconscious. Or at least that wasn't the case for me. I could hear things, voices, machines beeping, footsteps. I just couldn't move. I couldn't open my eyes, couldn't speak, couldn't even twitch a finger. It was like being trapped in my own body, screaming for help, but completely silent. At first, the voices were comforting. I heard my mom's voice almost every day, reading to me or just talking about her day. It made me feel safe, like I wasn't completely alone. I heard doctors and nurses coming in and out, talking in low voices. Sometimes I felt hands adjusting my IV or blankets. It was all a blur, floating in and out of consciousness, like perpetually being on the edge of a dream. Sometimes I'd hear them clearly, and other times their voices would blend into the beeping machines or distant murmur of hospital noise. But then I started hearing another voice, a man's voice. It didn't sound like the nurses or doctors. Before he would arrive, and once he left, I'd always hear the faint, distant squeak of wheels, like an old janitor cart or a patient's wheelchair slowly rolling down the hallway. It became the cue that he was coming or going. I remember the first time I heard it. I couldn't make out the words at first. It sounded like he was humming or mumbling or something. Then I heard him say my name, Jessica. It made me extremely uncomfortable. Feeling such intense negative emotions in a state of paralysis is an utterly horrible experience. There's nowhere for you to go, and you feel completely helpless and at the mercy of the external world. Being stationary for so long, I had no sense of time. He would come back when it seemed like the general hum of activity in the hospital would die down, which I guessed was at night. Maybe like an overnight maintenance worker or another patient or something. He'd be close to my bed, talking in this sing-song voice, saying things I didn't fully understand. Sometimes he'd tell me about his day, what he did, or what he planned to do. Sometimes he'd just talk in gibberish. Other times he'd talk about me, how peaceful I looked, how beautiful I was, and how no one would ever know if he did something. His words got worse over time, darker. He talked about all the things he could do to me while I was lying there helpless, how easy it would be, how much fun he'd have. He described it in vivid detail. I wanted to scream, to move, to push him away, to do anything, but my body wouldn't respond. One night I could hear the squeaks coming down the hall, and my heart rate monitor began to escalate. The squeaking stopped outside my room, or maybe it was inside, I couldn't tell. Then a moment later I felt his hand on my arm. It was light, almost a caress. He ran his fingers down my forearm, tracing lines on my skin, whispering about how soft it was. He kept touching me, his fingers lingering, and then he just said flat out in this almost conversational tone as if he knew no one could hear him, "I could do anything to you." I don't know how long it went on. I was trapped in that darkness, listening to him, feeling his hands on me, powerless to stop it. I remember hearing him laugh and carry on this whole conversation between us. He even started to mimic my voice as he held my hand, pretending that I was responding to him and telling him what he wanted to hear, like we were in a relationship. This continued on for what felt like several nights in a row. Then, one day, he just didn't come back. I don't know if someone caught him or he just moved on to someone else. I woke up from the coma a week later. My mom was crying, hugging me, telling me how happy she was that I was awake. I wanted to tell her everything, but I couldn't find the words. When I was well enough to speak, I asked about the man. I described his voice, the things he said, and the squeaking sound. The nurse's face went pale. She told me there was no one who matched that description on the staff. I asked if anyone else had been in my room at night, and she shook her head. She said the night shift was quiet, just the janitor who cleaned the rooms. I asked to see him. I had to know if it was real, if it was him. They said he quit a week before I woke up. I never found out who he was or if he was even real. I have a huge amount of PTSD from this and have begun working through it with a therapist, but it's hard to talk with someone about something you can't even prove for sure was real. I still hear his voice sometimes when I'm laying in bed, whispering my name just like he did when I was trapped in that hospital room, unable to scream. I don't usually like to talk about my personal life, so I'd like to keep this as anonymous as possible. I don't have an amazing job, and I travel a lot for work, so I'm pretty used to staying in cheap hotels and motels. Most of them are pretty standard, clean enough and quiet enough, nothing fancy, and that's fine with me. All I need is a bed to crash out on and a door that locks. However, if I had listened to the weird feeling in my gut when I pulled into this place, I would have completely avoided the traumatic experience I'm about to share with you. It was a last-minute booking. I was driving through a small town on my way to a client meeting and needed a place to crash for the night. It was the only vacancy I could find nearby, an old run-down motel down some back road with a neon sign that had a couple burnt-out letters. It was one of those single-story places and pretty neglected, to be honest. I decided to check the reviews online before committing. They were all over-the-top positive, which seemed off to me, like one that read, "By far the best motel I've ever stayed in. I'll be back." I didn't want to be a snob, but it just didn't look in decent condition at all and was so off the beaten path I didn't know how this could possibly be a real review. It just seemed too good to be true, but I didn't have anywhere else to go, so I pulled the trigger. I wish I'd listened to my intuition. I pulled into the lot, got my things out of the car, and walked toward the main building. When I opened the door to the front office, the clerk was just sitting there, hands on his lap, turned toward the door, smiling at me like he'd been waiting for me. He didn't even speak until I reached the counter. He just watched me and smiled, which struck me as strange. He was middle-aged, balding, and wearing a brightly colored polo shirt that seemed oddly cheerful for such a run-down place. It also seemed like he was blushing really hard, which sort of made the situation more awkward. I wondered if he might be new there or something, which might explain his demeanor. I booked the room and he handed me the key to room 5 with a big, almost overly enthusiastic smile, saying, "Welcome. Let me know if you need anything at all." The way he said it was so odd. It was like someone who didn't know how to talk to people trying to act like friendly or normal or something. Then, almost as an afterthought, he pulled out a small plate of homemade cookies from behind the desk, wrapped in cellophane, and held them out toward me. He told me they were complimentary and to try one. I didn't want to be rude, so I took one and thanked him. I told him I wasn't hungry and that I would save it for later, but he slammed the plate down and stood up in this sudden movement like he could barely control himself and told me that I needed to try it now because I was the only person who was at the motel for the night and they would all go to waste otherwise. There was this awkward beat and then he laughed like he was trying to compensate for the weird outburst. I didn't know what to say, so I just quickly put the cookie in my mouth, chewed it, and said it was good. It was awful though, totally bitter and disgusting with this medicinal aftertaste. He smiled, sat back down, and told me to have a nice night. I try not to judge people and understand that everyone has their personality quirks, but the whole thing was so odd. I walked back outside and across the lot to my room. The room was about what I expected. Outdated wallpaper, a creaky bed with an old floral bedspread, and a TV that looked like it hadn't worked since the late 90s. Those reviews made no sense. I set my bag down, locked the door, and collapsed on the bed, crawling under the covers. I set my alarm and started to scroll through my phone, going back through the reviews once more. but a strange wave of fatigue suddenly hit me, so intense I started to get the spins. I didn't even bother changing out of my clothes or brushing my teeth. I just pulled the covers up and passed out. At some point during the night, I woke up feeling cold. The lights were off, which I didn't remember doing, and light from the green neon sign poured in through the window. I went to get up, but I couldn't move. My body felt like it was made of stone. I tried to reach for the blanket, but nothing happened. My fingers twitched, but I shit you not, the rest of my body wouldn't respond. My eyes could only half open, and through my blurry vision, I could just make out the foot of the bed. The covers were gone. They were neatly folded up at the foot of the bed, exposing me completely. My pants were also pulled down to my ankles, and my shirt was up above my belly button. My mind was so foggy and sluggish, lurching from thought to thought in this jarring way, and I couldn't fully process what I was seeing. I felt drunk and thought I must be dreaming. Then it happened. A flash of light at the same instant as a faint click, followed by a soft whirring sound. It came from the darkest corner of the room, near the dresser. I couldn't turn my head, but my eyes strained toward the noise. The glow from the vacancy sign outside was just enough to illuminate the outline of a figure standing there. Another flash and click, followed by the same whirring sound. It was a camera, a Polaroid. I could hear the soft click as the photo ejected and began to develop. Then the figure's hand reached out and caught the paper as it slid out. They stood there, looking down at the photo, obscured by the dark. I began to sweat, and my pulse started thudding in my neck. I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. I tried to call out, but my lips wouldn't move. I just kind of moaned into the darkness and drooled on myself. Whoever this person was took a step closer, just enough that the light from the window fell on the side of their face. It was the fucking motel clerk. His eyes were wide and hungry, watching me with this sick fascination. He lifted the camera and took another photo. My body was completely frozen and helpless as he circled the bed. His gaze never left me. When he got to my side of the bed, he leaned down and was so close I could feel his breath on my face. His mouth was just inches from my ear, and he made this licking sound like he was sucking on a lollipop or something. Then he whispered to me, "Hello, handsome. You're perfect." That's when I must have blacked out, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the window, and I could move again. I bolted upright, covered in sweat, and looked around the room. It was empty. The blanket was back on the bed, the dresser was undisturbed, and my bag was closed and sitting exactly where I'd left it. My clothes were exactly as I remembered them. I wanted to believe it was just a nightmare, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I grabbed my things and got out of there as fast as I could. As I was loading my bag into the car, the motel clerk appeared in the office doorway. He watched me with that same cheery expression and then waved at me. I got in the car, slamming the door shut. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him standing there holding something in his hand. I slammed on my brakes, staring into the mirror. From where I was, I couldn't tell if it was a Polaroid or just a list on a piece of paper, but he was staring down at it as he turned and walked back into the office, closing the door behind him. I didn't stick around to ask questions. I drove straight to my meeting, trying to convince myself that it was just a nightmare. It all seemed so surreal and horrible. I have a history with really bad nightmares, but this just seemed different. Later that night, I was able to examine myself more thoroughly and didn't find any cause for alarm. But to this day, I don't know whether what I experienced was some demented night terror or reality. I've had a few notable experiences with sleep paralysis when I was a child and even as a teenager. For preface, when I was a child in the late 90s, my family and I moved to a house in a small town in Northeast Ohio. We lived at the bottom of a hill and only had a few neighbors. One of my neighbors had a few dogs outside, which will become a bit important later on. The first time I experienced sleep paralysis was at the beginning of August in the summer of 2004 when I was 11 years old. I remember my family and I having a pretty good day, shopping for school supplies, clothes, and then going home to enjoy some video games on my brother's N64 before going to bed in high spirits. Nothing about that day would have prepared me for the nightmare experience I went through after we all went to bed. I had a typical nightmare a kid would have about being back at school after a summer break. In the dream, I was being bullied and being made fun of for what I was wearing. At some point, I realized I was dreaming and forced myself to wake up. When I woke up, I heard footsteps in my room. At first, I thought it was one of my siblings, or Mom getting water from the pitcher I had in there, but I wouldn't be writing this if that were the case. Almost immediately, I could smell the strong scent of cigarette smoke coming from whoever was in my room. No one in my house smoked. I turned to look toward the window and saw the silhouette of a man with wiry hair wearing what I thought was a cowboy hat and what seemed to be a large coat. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew that I didn't recognize them as anyone in my family. Now I have to add that at that moment I wasn't experiencing anything like sleep paralysis. Initially, I feared that someone had broken into the house, and out of fear of getting hurt or worse, I closed my eyes and pretended to be asleep. Whoever it was approached me, sat at the corner of my bed, and grabbed my wrist. The sensation of his hand on my wrist felt like fire, and immediately I found myself unable to move at all. I couldn't even open my eyes. I felt like I was trapped inside my own body as this was happening. He held onto my wrist for a while, and I remember wanting to scream for help, but I couldn't even whimper. I felt him get closer to my face, and I could feel his hot breath on my neck. Then suddenly, he got up and left the room. I just laid there in fear and disbelief for a few minutes after that, still unable to move. The only sound was of the ticking clock in my room. I tried to open my eyes, move my hands or feet, anything, but I still couldn't move. Then, from the hallway outside my room, I heard the loudest, most diabolical laugh I have ever heard in my life. It was low and high-pitched all at once. That's the best that I can describe it. It was nothing like the typical demonic laughs you hear in movies or in TV shows. I could hear my heart pounding in my head, and my neighbor's dogs all started barking ferociously seconds after I heard that diabolical laugh. I remember feeling dizzy as I heard the dogs begin barking, and everything just going blank. The next thing I remember, I was waking up and it was morning. I lifted my hand and looked at my wrist. It was bruised where the man had grabbed me. I ran and told my mom that someone had broken in and assaulted me, and I showed her my bruises. She took me seriously, and her and my older siblings looked around for any sign of entry. There were none. I told my mom and siblings exactly what had happened and about the diabolical laugh and the dogs barking outside, to which they all exchanged a concerned and puzzled look to one another. None of them had heard it. It was as if whoever or whatever it was only wanted me to hear and to know they were there. I can't explain what happened that night, but I will never forget that experience even 20 years later. It was the first of many experiences with sleep paralysis living in that house. I was terrified of the dark for years after that and refused to sleep alone until we ended up moving out of that house. As for that house, no one seemed to live in it for very long after us. Eventually, the house itself was abandoned by the new owners, and the town had it demolished altogether. I often wonder what happened in that house before us, and what ended up happening to the people after us. I guess I'll never know.